Thank you, Carolina. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our SpedNet Wilton webinar, What Parents Should Know About School Discipline for Kids with Learning Disabilities, ADHD, and Autism Spectrum Disorder, featuring attorney Robert Tedisco. Today's talk is presented in partnership with Wilton Public Schools, and we're grateful for their partnership. Attorney Tedisco is a nationally recognized author, motivational speaker, adult diagnosed with ADHD, and practicing attorney specializing in special education law, criminal defense, and school discipline. This is a very important topic to us because students with learning and attention challenges are twice as likely as their non-disabled peers to be suspended or expelled because of social, emotional, or behavioral problems. So thank you, Attorney Tedisco, for joining us today on this topic. All the information from today's webinar will be posted on our website, www.spednetwilton.org. That includes Attorney Tedisco's PowerPoint, any related articles, and a video of today's webinar. For those of you who want to share information from our webinars with your spouse or your child's team, videos of all of our webinars are on our website and our YouTube channel. If you can't make a webinar in the future, please rest assured that you'll be able to access it on our website. Our website has been recently updated, so take a look. It's organized and designed to be easy to use, informative, and inspiring. In addition to dozens of videos, it features our interactive guide to special services, bringing knowledge to the table, how to be an effective advocate for your child. It also has articles on ADHD, ASD, NVLD, EF, and everything else we can think of that parents might need in advocating for their children. Our moderators today are co-presidents Carolina Corrigan and Janine Kelly, myself. And Eve Kessler is the co-founder and executive director of SpedNet Wilton, and she is here today as well. Please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A. Please do not use the chat. It's difficult to keep track of the questions in the chat, and we will do our best to answer the questions at the end of the webinar. Also, please be mindful that this is an open forum that's being recorded, and we cannot guarantee confidentiality. So you may not want to include any personal information in your questions. Just keep that in mind. That's very important. If you do have any personal questions at the end of the webinar, I'm sure we can provide you with information that Attorney Tedisco, you can be in contact directly with Attorney Tedisco. Lastly, any information provided by the speaker or moderators is intended for your general purposes only and not intended to be legal or therapeutic advice. Thank you for joining us today, and I will now hand the mic over to Attorney Tedisco. Welcome.
Thank you. So I appreciate the fact that SpedNet Wilton is giving me the opportunity to reach out to parents. I know things have been very difficult with COVID, and having this as a forum is really helpful now as kids are getting back. We're going to cover this in the program today, but I think that kids with special needs, especially kids with ADHD or behavioral disorders, really are having a harder time transitioning back to in-person learning, and it really does bode poorly for them in terms of school discipline and potential contact with the juvenile and criminal justice system. So just to kind of give you an overview of what I want to cover today, I use ADHD as kind of like a hub for other disabilities for a number of reasons. First of all, as an adult with ADHD myself, I've got 57 years of experience with it, but also I find that it is fairly common that ADHD co-occurs with other disorders, which will magnify a lot of these behaviors. And also there are a lot of behavioral issues that parents of kids with ADHD will be faced with that can impact school discipline and potential contact with the system. I'm going to talk a little bit about COVID and how that impacts everything, and also understanding where these behaviors come from. Understanding your child's disability, I think, is very important because that'll lead to some proactive measures that I'm going to suggest to kind of hopefully minimize maybe some of these incidents from reoccurring. I'm going to talk about school discipline from the perspective of New York, but I would say 95% of the legislation is federal. It also does apply in Connecticut. I'm going to talk about discipline for students with disability and how the procedural framework works. And also, I'm going to cover quite a few slides on codes of conduct at school and how They really are slanted against children with behavioral disabilities by the way they're written and how it's important for parents really to become familiar with that. We're going to be talking about some practical examples and practical strategies for minimizing all of this. I'm going to talk about the increased risk of school discipline and criminal prosecution for students with ADHD. And again, some proactive strategies to kind of navigate this. And again, I went to law school. I got a law degree. I didn't get a magic wand. Nothing I say here today is going to prevent all of these things from happening, but it could be the difference between navigating a minefield with a map in your hand versus being chased through one blindfolded. If you know what's coming, at least you have some options, and so there are things you can do proactively to address that. So let's jump right in. All right. What is ADHD? It's a neurobiological disorder that affects the prefrontal cortex of your brain. It's the portion of your brain that really governs executive functioning, okay? It also interacts with your neurotransmitter system. And those are the chemicals that get generated and reach your brain to show you how to act a certain way. And the three, I guess, culprits here are dopamine, which is the chemical that regulates the pleasure center of your brain, serotonin, and norepinephrine, which is essentially adrenaline. And as a result, you have students who are constantly craving pleasures, and they're doing that through a gravitation to high stimulation activities. We call them high stim. And I'll explain what that looks like, but I'm sure a lot of you parents are starting to kind of shake your heads because that may be explaining, what you're seeing on a regular basis. Okay, executive functions or the prefrontal cortex really is kind of like a conductor in a symphony or an office manager in your office. It's responsible for organization, prioritization, time perception, impulse control. I highlighted that one because, in my opinion, when it comes to behavioral issues, impulse control is really one of the behavioral culprits. These kids know the difference between right and wrong. They know what they're not supposed to be doing, but the difficulty is not knowing the difference between right and wrong. It's an inability to overcome the impulse to do what you need that instant gratification from. And that is certainly a very big problem. Hyperactivity in some cases, which could be considered disruptive from an outsider's viewpoint or perspective, and also can be viewed as aggressive, which can be very difficult to address from an educator's perspective. Attention regulation, and this is not really with respect to discipline, but that is one of the issues. And it's important for parents to understand the difference between attention and attention regulation, okay? There are parents that'll come to me and say, they're saying my son can't pay attention, but he can play video games for 8 hours. It makes no sense. It's not an inability to attend to something. It is an inability to regulate your attention. There is either no attention or extreme hyper focus. There's no baseline or midline that most people have. And that is problematic for an outsider to understand. And for instance, I will tell my wife, if I'm stuck in the office and I come home very late, I will tell her, if I can kind of find that hyper focus, I typically will try to direct it towards, things that I'm working on, projects, and I kind of try to ride it out because I don't always have that hyper focus. And students will kind of experience the same thing. The problem is what they're hyper focusing on cannot always be the most social of activities, and that's where they get into trouble. Okay, short-term memory is also an issue, but it really doesn't apply as much to behavioral issues that we're going to be talking about today. All right, let's see. Okay, this is one that I think is just an important illustration. When you talk about ADHD and the central nervous system, especially with respect to the neurotransmitters. And I apologize if there are any doctors out there listening, because I'm sure I'm grossly simplifying this. But when we were all in middle school, we learned that if you put your hand on the hot stove, that a signal goes up your arm to your brain and says it's hot, move your hand. Okay. So we automatically have this visual that the nervous system is kind of like a circuit of electricity, that wire that goes to the light bulb kind of when the power comes on. But unfortunately, that's not how our brains work and our central nervous systems work. It is not one continuous wire. It is a series of disconnected short wires, and they are connected. Those gaps are connected by these neurotransmitters: dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine. And they have to be created in sufficient amounts, and there has to be a receptor available to accept those chemicals for a free flow. And what happens typically is, if there is a problem, people with ADHD, those high stimulation seeking people, will often create like crisis situations because they are manufacturing excessive dopamine or adrenaline to kind of bridge the gap that is not working properly medically. And so it's a form of self-medication. Sometimes it symptomizes as substance abuse, sometimes gambling. As these kids get older, it can be sexual experimentation. And that is really where this is coming from. Okay, I use this model to really kind of try to get people to visualize what it's like inside of here, the ADHD mind. If you picture a place like New York City, for instance, that's a center of culture and finance and business and government or whatever it is, and people are coming from all over the world to get to this place. But instead of having a well-run airport, international airport, or a couple of international airports, there's one poorly run landing strip. Okay, these thoughts or stimulus is coming in from everywhere, and it's got no place to land. So what happens is, these thoughts or impulses kind of like circle the airport in like a holding pattern, which is what they do when there's too many planes and not enough places to land. But if one of those planes had an emergency on it, okay, some type of security risk or a medical risk, it would get instant clearance to land. And the reason is because it's an emergency. So everything else gets put aside to focus on this one thing. And people with ADHD, especially students with ADHD, gravitate towards crisis situations, and as I said earlier, kind of manufacture these crisis situations as a means of forced prioritization. It's a way to force yourself to focus on something because it's an emergency, waiting till the last minute for that book report or whatever it is. Or in the context of today's presentation, stirring up chaos in the classroom, because many of us feel that place in the middle of chaos is where we feel most comfortable. I call it being in the eye of the storm. Okay. And so a lot of these kids kind of feel that way. And that is their sweet spot, so to speak, which is not good for the rest of the classroom or the common operation of education. And that poses a huge risk. Now, other symptoms are poor sense of self-esteem. One myth about ADHD is that it is something that we think of with respect to hyperactive boys. It is present in girls, not as often hyperactive, but there are some hyperactive girls. And statistically, it is a lifespan disorder. What people often traditionally thought was some of the hyperactivity would decrease after puberty. So people kind of thought it was a sign of immaturity that kids would outgrow. But I can tell you, if you spent about 15 minutes with my wife, you would realize that I have not outgrown a lot of these potential problematic traits. These kids have a very low frustration tolerance, which also becomes an issue with respect to following rules at school and getting into trouble, violating the code of conduct. These students will also have a lot more difficulty learning from consequences. And the traditional form of discipline is to attach some type of negative consequence to a behavior to kind of dissuade it, but that does not happen. And instead of once or twice to learn from your mistakes, it may take 7 or 8 or 10 times for a student to really have it sink in a way, if it's done correctly, that it really makes a difference. Also, as I mentioned earlier, ADHD, there's an old saying, ADHD rarely walks alone. Statistically, in about 65 to 70% of cases, there is some type of co-occurring learning disability or a co-occurring mental health condition that can magnify or exaggerate a lot of these symptoms. Common ones are bipolar disorder. A big one when it comes to discipline is oppositional defiant disorder, ODD, which, if left untreated, can really morph into a full-blown conduct disorder. And that is problematic because that is virtually untreatable. And there are consequences to that when it comes to discipline. I'll show you a little bit later on how that really can heighten logarithmically or exponentially, I should say, a student's uh, the co-occurrences of a disability with substance use disorder, which is problematic legally as well as in terms of school discipline. All right. I want to talk a little bit about the impact of COVID-19. We're kind of coming out of the cave right now, and we're getting back to, in-person learning. But the thing that you have to understand is that the worst thing that can happen to someone with ADHD is to have an unstructured environment. These students will hate structure, but it is something that is necessary because inherently they can't, with an executive functioning disorder, which ADHD is, they really don't have that office manager to kind of regulate themselves. They need their parents' support. They need educators' support. And in many cases, working with an outside influence like a coach or a therapist is really crucial to kind of keep them focused and provide that structure. When we switched to remote learning, the structure kind of got disconnected. It's almost like a kid with ADHD going from a highly structured environment to a completely unstructured environment in college where they often will crash and burn without the right support. And now we are in a situation where quarantine lasted significantly longer than anyone anticipated it would. People were hopeful that it would be, a month or 2 months, maybe the end of that year. We went into the following year. It was really very difficult for these kids. There's also another old proverb that says, an idle mind is the devil's workshop. That is no truer for anyone else than people with ADHD. If we are, boredom is often the culprit of those negative impulses. And so transitioning, what happens is kids will find themselves getting into trouble. If it's a remote-based learning platform, I found a lot of the disciplinary cases that I was involved with were kids who were posting something online or online bullying in a chat room or something like that, because there wasn't the day-to-day contact that they were having with each other. Now that we are getting back to in-person education, I'm finding that a lot of these kids are pushing back on that structure because they're not used to it anymore. And that is, I mean, as adults, we're seeing it. Even non-disabled adults are having, as much as people wanted to get back into the office, getting up and commuting every day when you haven't been used to it for a year or so is kind of difficult. It's a whole different lifestyle. If you kind of think about it as almost like a combat veteran when they come back to the real world, has a lot of difficulty assimilating because there are more rules. When they were kind of unstructured in a combat situation, even in the military, which is highly structured, when they're in battle, those rules are relaxed and there's a lot more excitement. Coming back to making that transition back to structure is very, very difficult. And I say this every time I speak, not just to get a laugh, but high school or middle school is probably the closest thing outside of the penal system to a jail. These kids are housed in a place that's on lockdown. The bells ring and they're shuttled from here to there. They get their time in the yard every day, and they're constantly counting heads. And they get used to that structure, even though they hate it. So statistically, um, kids with ADHD are also at higher risk because for coming into contact with school discipline because of their low frustration tolerance, high impulsivity, and that high STEM-seeking activity, which is now magnified because they're now coming back out into the world and having human contact with their friends. Statistically, um, school discipline happens to roughly 50% of all students, but the rates are much higher for students with disabilities, students of color, and certainly of students, disabled students of color. And I want to just take a second to also mention something. Disabilities like ADHD, learning disabilities, uh, don't discriminate across socioeconomic or cultural lines. But what is important to understand is the access to information and treatment does in fact discriminate quite harshly in this country. And so there are a lot more students with disabilities who in underserved communities that are not diagnosed. Parents don't have the information or access to health care, or certainly mental health care. And so you have a much higher risk among students of color and also disabled students of color. Now, these are some sobering statistics, and they kind of get worse each year. Disabled students are twice as likely to be suspended out of school than their non-disabled counterparts. And I don't believe that that figure is accurate. I believe it's much higher. And the reason is because, I have in parentheses here, IDEA, the statistics that the federal government keeps are with respect to students who have an active IEP, which means they're classified for special education. It does not include students who are undiagnosed. It does not include students with 504 plans, which also are a lot of students with ADHD. And just to give you a quick historical note, before the 1997 reauthorization of IDEA, ADHD was not considered a classifiable disability. And so all the kids with ADHD got 504 plans. A lot of organizations lobbied very heavily, CHAD among them, and ADHD was added to the other health impaired category. So now students with ADHD can be classified and get an IEP since 1997, 1998, whenever it was signed in. But a lot of schools still tell parents throughout the country, and I get emails and calls about this constantly, that their school is telling them that a child with ADHD doesn't qualify for an IEP, they get 504 plans. That is not the law, that is school district policy. And it's important to educate yourself and hopefully educate your school about that. Disabled students of color are 25% of disabled students that are suspended or expelled. And I believe they are 12% of the population. African-American students are 27% of students referred to law enforcement and only 16% of the population. Disabled students, again, tracked with IEPs, are 25% of students that are arrested or referred to law enforcement from school incidents, and they are only 12% of the population. ADHD is 4 to 5 times more prevalent in a jail setting than in a classroom. And incarcerated juveniles, 28% of them have active IEPs. That is the number that the federal government, which again does not factor in undiagnosed or students with 504 plans. So it's important to understand that. And it's really important if you suspect that your child has an executive functioning disorder, ADHD, or other mental health condition, especially if it impacts them behaviorally, is to seek an evaluation before something happens. Because while legally it is possible after the fact, it is much more difficult to do as a practical matter. Now, just a little bit about the process in terms of special education law or just discipline in general. An initial suspension is the principal at your school only has the authority to suspend for up to 5 days. Okay, so typically, if an incident occurs, you will get a letter from the principal saying your student is suspended for 5 days, but that's not the end of it. If it is a suspension or conduct that they believe is going to warrant more than a 5-day suspension, that ends the power of the principal, and the superintendent must get involved. Anything beyond 5 days, the superintendent must serve notice and notice a hearing within 5 days, where you are entitled to appear, offer your own side of the facts, and bring an attorney. And I highly recommend bringing an attorney. The hearings are conducted by a superintendent, or the superintendent can designate a hearing officer. The problem is that the hearing officer will issue an opinion, but the law gives the superintendent the ability to accept that finding or reject that finding. However, I believe that if the hearing officer finds in your favor, but the superintendent rejects that finding, I think you have excellent grounds on appeal as the superintendent acting arbitrarily. But that is something you should really speak to an attorney about. Now, the hearing comes in 2 parts, okay? The suspension hearing. And incidentally, almost nobody gets detention anymore. These kids are getting suspended as a matter of course. The hearing is in 2 parts. The first part of the hearing is to determine whether or not your child, A, did what they are accused of, and B, whether or not that conduct violated the school's code of conduct, okay? The second phase of the hearing is to determine what the appropriate punishment should be. Suspension, no suspension, expulsion, or they don't use that word anymore. Now it's called permanent suspension for some reason. That's for all kids. If your child has a disability, there is another level of this. What happens is, if your child is found to have committed the conduct that they are accused of, which I say with probably 99 to 100% certainty they are guilty of. What happens is, and the violation of the code of conduct, which are, I'm going to show you examples in a few minutes, written so vaguely that they really are slanted against kids with ADHD in terms of like disorderly, disrespectful, and disruptive, just those generalized terms. Once that phase is conducted, if your child has a 504 plan or an IEP, before you get to the punishment stage, there is something else that happens. It's called a manifestation determination, okay, which is essentially an IEP meeting that's squeezed in between the 2 of those. And the issue at the manifestation meeting is to determine whether or not the child's conduct, what they did, was a symptom or a manifestation of their disability, okay? And I will tell you, if it's found to be a manifestation, a student cannot be suspended for more than 10 days, and that's cumulative 10 days, which means that it's for the whole year. So not just for this conduct, So you have to really be vigilant and see if they were suspended for 2 days in the beginning of the year, another 3 days, and this is a pattern of activity. Okay, if it accumulates to 10 days, they cannot be suspended for more than 10 days. Um, if there is an exception, if a weapon or drugs is used, or if there's serious injury, it can be up to 45 school days. But I will tell you that the word manifestation, okay, like sticks in the throat of the principal and the superintendent. They almost always fight on the concept of manifestation because they believe that it is an excuse for students with disabilities to break the school rules. Okay. And that is a huge practical issue that parents really are challenged with on a regular basis. If you have a student who is a repeat offender or a student who is potentially a behavioral problem, that is going to be something that you're going to run into. And there are some proactive strategies you can employ that will kind of minimize that. So that is basically what the law works. If they find that it is not a manifestation, then a student can be suspended as a student with a disability is suspended the same as any other student. And I have been seeing some really shocking suspensions, a year and a half. There are some really kind of crazy things happening these days. Okay, so this is just a visual model of the factual determination. What happened and did it violate the code of conduct? And then they go to the punishment phase. Just very quickly, for the factual determination, they're only allowed to look at the four corners of the superintendent's letter, this particular incident. When it comes to punishment, their entire history as a student is looked at. Now, when manifestation is in play, it's conducted by the IEP team. They determine whether or not it was a manifestation or symptom of their disability. And it's a direct result of the students, whether or not it was a failure of the school to implement the IEP or 504 plan, or whether or not the plan was appropriate or not. And that's significant because I've sat in these meetings and they will say, well, his IEP didn't say he hit anybody before. And what you should, the statement that you should be making is, well, maybe it should have been in the IEP. And that is really what this is all about. And this is an important point. If you're listening and you want to take one or two things out of this presentation, this is an important one. Because the school is going to view this as an excuse because of a child's disability, you really have to change that mindset. You are not going in there to say, my child should get special treatment because he's got ADHD. What you really want to say here is, we need to understand, because this happened because of my child's disability, why this happened, and what measures we can put into place through his IEP or some other behavioral intervention to prevent it from happening in the future. So if you're worried about the safety of the other students, that's what this is going to accomplish. And there's something in the law in IEP and Section 504 that students from K to 12, the school district has an obligation known as child find. And what that means is that it's their responsibility to seek out and determine and assess the disabilities of the students who live in their district, and to provide appropriate supports to address those disabilities. And basically your argument here is that this happened and we shouldn't get special treatment because of the disability, but this was a child find violation, essentially, that this could have been avoided and we can afford it in the future. Also, okay, so the manifestation is kind of brought in between those two sections. And what happens is they have to review, if it is a manifestation, they have to review the IEP or the 504 plan. They also have to conduct, and this is also very important, if you are a parent of a student with oppositional defiant disorder, with ADHD and oppositional defiant disorder co-occurring, a child on the autism spectrum where the antisocial behaviors are problematic, you really should ask for this before a manifestation hearing. A functional behavioral assessment and a behavioral intervention plan, okay? Asking for that ahead of time puts them on notice that you suspect that there may be issues and you are asking for the school to address them. For kids on the autism spectrum, when they have some type of temper tantrum, sometimes, I mean, there's an example of a 6-year-old student who was having a tantrum and the teachers tried to calm her down. I think it was in Virginia. And she hit one of the teachers and she was actually not only suspended, but arrested, okay? When a student is in that, I call it, if you think about a car's odometer, in the red zone, okay? There's nothing that's gonna bring them out of it in any kind of easy way. The key here to an FBA or a BIP, sometimes they call it a BIP, is to understand what that student's triggers are and to modify their environment so to avoid those triggers from happening, so you won't have that meltdown, you won't have that tantrum, or it will be at a much lower degree so it can be controlled in some way. And putting school on notice ahead of a manifestation hearing or a disciplinary incident really lets them know that you're anticipating this. And in a manifestation meeting, you could say, you know, I asked for this a long time ago and no one addressed it. What manifestation is, it's important for a lot of reasons. Number one, it acts as an added protection to minimize the amount of days a student can be suspended. It also puts these safeguards into place and also requires a review of the IEP or 504 plan to potentially put additional behavioral supports into place. I represent a lot of kids in New York City that are on the spectrum, and getting applied behavioral analysis therapy is really very important, where somebody will track those triggers ahead of time and statistically track them and modify their environment to minimize the behavioral episodes from occurring, or to shorten their duration, or develop strategies to bring them out of that heightened place. So that's very important. But we're going to see later on that manifestation can also go a long way towards mitigation for students that ultimately get arrested in a court setting. So that is very important for parents to understand. Okay, what if your child is unclassified or doesn't have a 504 plan? Okay, you are in a much more difficult situation. I said before that the concept of manifestation kind of sticks in the throat of your educators. It does even more so if your child gets in trouble at school and you say, well, you know, I always thought that they had ADHD or they had a behavioral problem, ODD, then I want them classified. You have to provide written notice and a consent for an evaluation immediately. But the schools are less likely, they have to do the evaluation, but they're going to be a lot less likely to classify your student after the fact as a practical concern. So just be aware of that as a potential stumbling block that you may face in that situation. It's important also, and I've got some slides coming up, I'm kind of jumping ahead of myself here, but as a proactive measure, getting your, I would say one of the things that you can do to minimize a lot of these potential minefield situations is getting your child evaluated as early as possible. If you anticipate this before you get that call that they're being suspended, and get your clinician actively involved to recommend behavioral strategies for the school to employ. Smaller class size, ABA therapy, having an aide, modified types of consequences that are not going to, and again, modified consequences don't mean that there should be no consequences. But a typical example is a hyperactive kid that doesn't perform like they're supposed to in class, and a traditional form of consequences, a teacher will say, well, then you can't go outside for recess, okay? That's a disaster. That is a recipe for disaster in the afternoon, because I'm not saying this child should have recess and his bad behavior should be encouraged. What I'm saying to that teacher is, do you want that hyperactive kid who's already misbehaved and has been required to sit in a chair when everybody else is outside playing? Do you want that kid in your classroom in the afternoon? There should be a consequence. There should be a well thought out consequence, but not one that's going to make that student push back, and it's going to be a much worse situation in the classroom later on for him and for everybody else. Okay. Um, now, federally, if you request an evaluation after the fact, it has to be done on an expedited basis, but federally, it does not have a certain time frame. In New York State, it's required once you complete the consent, the school has 15 school days to do the evaluation. Okay, that is not a common time frame. Usually it's kind of open-ended, like the federal statute. So you should check which state you are in. I don't know what the rule is in Connecticut, but there are things you can do. There are some case notes that say we don't have a time for expedited, but it should be less than regular circumstances. What you can do is, if the school is not doing it quick enough and they want to move towards the punishment phase, you can file for an impartial hearing. And one of the things you request is a stay of the punishment phase until the evaluation is completed and a determination is made. So that is something that you can do. Another consequence of taking a child out of school in terms of an evaluation, I mean, not evaluation, discipline, is not only that they are being punished for their disability, but they're also losing class time and services that they're not getting and that they need. The kid who's sitting in the principal's office all day is not getting their instruction. They're not getting their OT, their PT, whatever they need, their speech therapy. So parents just have to be mindful of those things. All right, building a record as a proactive matter is really important. Everything you do should be in writing. I mentioned before, requesting a behavioral assessment or behavioral intervention plan, requesting a certain behavioral intervention like ABA therapy if it's warranted. As you see those behavioral reports, your contact with the teacher, any emails or phone conversations, you should reduce to writing. So nobody can say in the future, well, we had no idea that this was an issue. If you build a record, you can use it later on. Report cards are an excellent source of these, okay? And I often will tell parents to use the code of conduct to their advantage, because if a school tells you that your child who has a behavioral disability or a disability that manifests in a behavioral way is not entitled to services or classification because they're not failing, that is not the law. If you put it this way, if your child was an honor student and they did something terrible at school, if you used their scholastic achievement as a defense, the school would tell you in that discipline meeting, there's a lot more to being a student at this school than the grades on their report card. Okay. And if you read the code of conduct, which I strongly encourage you to do, you will see all of the things that are expected of your child or that they are evaluated on that have nothing to do with academic achievement. They're supposed to be respectful and prompt and respect each other's property and not be disruptive. And I'm going to show you some language that is going to, make lights go off in your head that, that could be any ADHD kid. But the report card is also very important because there's a column on the report card, that quarterly evaluation of your child. There'll be like a B in math or a C in math. And the column will say things like, Johnny is a bright student, but I can't get him to shut his mouth, or he's constantly disrupting the class, or he's always late to class, okay? That is on the report card, on the academic evaluation in a way. So use that to your advantage in terms of building that record to protect your child, okay? Now, proactive strategies. Have them evaluated early on if you suspect it will be an issue. I had a woman in one of these seminars raise her hand and said, you know, at what point do you have your child evaluated? I think my son is hyperactive. He's 4 or 5. You know, is it too young? Is it just because of immaturity? And my feeling is this: as a parent, you know. As a parent, you know if your child's behavior based upon other child's behaviors or other children's behaviors is something that could be an issue at some point down the line. If your child, you know, is, you know, very physical with their hands and touches other kids, invades their space, or is very, you know, has a hair trigger temper or has meltdowns, you know, very easily, more so than other students, that is something you really have to be, that has to be addressed. If your child is oppositional defiant behavior, as I mentioned earlier, can really morph into a full-scale personality disorder, which is virtually untreatable, okay? So have your child evaluated either privately or through the school as early as you can. Request an IEP or a 504 plan. Ask for neuropsych testing that will essentially build a blueprint for what you're requesting in terms of behavioral supports or interventions, okay? And involve your clinician in the process. Have your doctor, if they can, attend the meetings, make those recommendations, write those letters with you, okay? In terms of appellate rights, if you disagree, all students have to appeal to the Board of Education. That time typically varies by school. It's in the code of conduct, so you really have to be aware of that. So, you know, by all means, look through the code of conduct. Then if you lose there, and you will, it's rare to see a school board overturn the decision of a school superintendent at a hearing. But you have to make that appeal first, because that entitles you, if you disagree with the decision, to go to the state over their head, okay? And if you go to the State Department of Education with your appeal and you lose there, then you can go to court, state or federal, but you must exhaust the administrative process first, okay? And again, the threshold is that the school and the state were acting arbitrarily with respect to your child's discipline, okay? For disabled student, it's the same as all students, but you have an additional layer of a practical additional layer of appeal, because that manifestation meeting that's wedged in between, if you disagree with the school's determination on manifestation, you can, it's a CSE meeting, essentially, Committee for Special Education. So you can file for an impartial hearing on the manifestation determination and request that it stay the rest of it. So that's kind of like a mini appeal before your appellate rights kick in. Okay, so that's another level of protection that students with disabilities have. Okay, the code of conduct is the law of the school. It's what governs, okay? Students and parents are expected to know it. Don't be like most parents, okay? Most parents see that there is a code of conduct and are relieved that there are some rules that their children have to follow, and that's it. If you read it, you will be shocked. I will tell you right now of the vague nature of it and how it can really impact students with disabilities. It's either handed out to your students or it's on the school's website. I keep a running file of every school I come into contact with of their code of conduct on my computer, so I have them. So just make sure you do that and you know what the procedures are, and do that before you get a call that your child is being suspended. All right. These are just some examples: running in the hallways, making unreasonable noise. Does that sound like a kid with ADHD? Using language or gestures that are profane, lewd, or vulgar. Willful act that disrupts the normal operation of the classroom or the school. Okay. Trespassing, computer electronic communications, unauthorized use of computers, software, internet, or inappropriate use of websites. Using cell phones during instructional time, failing to comply with reasonable direction of teachers, Does that sound like a kid with ADHD or oppositional defiant disorder? Lateness to school. We are all time challenged. And I'm not just trying to make you laugh here, but my wife actually introduces me to people as her late husband because I am. It's a perception of time issue, okay? Um, Skipping detention, failing to follow the rules as explained in the code of conduct is a violation of the code of conduct, lying to school personnel, inappropriate public displays of affection. I mean, I could go on, and they're here. These are all vague and slanted towards kids with disabilities. All right. These are violent ones, weapons, etc. Okay. The other catch-all phrase is endangering the safety, morals, or mental health or welfare of other students or school activities. Okay, that is a generalized phrase that, and these quotes here came out of codes of conduct from schools. These are real. I'm not making them up. Okay, some proactive strategies. Read the code of conduct so you know what your child, what standards they're being held to. And if you disagree or you think they are inappropriately vague, go to a school board meeting and voice your concerns about them. That is something that you can do. Understand how vulnerable your child is. Request a functional behavioral assessment and a behavioral intervention plan. That should be BIP, I apologize, proactively. I'll correct that before I send it to Eve. Involve your clinician proactively and reactively. If you get the letter from school, get some type of documentation, especially with respect to the concept of manifestation. You just don't think this is a manifestation of your child's disability, but your doctor is telling you this is a symptom. Involve your child to understand their behaviors, understanding why they get so angry at school or why they can't control themselves, and empower them to kind of weigh in on what we can do to prevent this from happening in the future. All right. Briefly, I'm going to talk about diversion of medication, which is problematic in and of itself. If kids are taking ADHD meds, they are Schedule II controlled substances, which are um, extremely restricted. If they share their medication with other students under the law, that is the same as selling, which is a felony in every jurisdiction. They are subject to prosecution, expulsion, and also feeding into the social stigmas that we're somehow getting these kids high. I've been taking stimulant medication now since I was 34 years old. So I'm dating myself, but like 14 years. So, and I will tell you, if it's supposed to be so addicting, why do I keep forgetting to take it? So, that is something, but kids, you have to have that conversation with your child, especially when they go off to college. What are they doing to safeguard their medication to make sure that no one else is having access to it? That's very important. All right. There was, this is a frightening statistic, a 10-year follow-up study done at Harvard. Adolescents with ADHD alone, no co-occurring conditions, had a 50% higher risk of substance use disorder. If ADHD co-occurred with conduct disorder, that increased risk triples. So from 150%, it becomes 450%. That is frightening. Okay. Other conduct issues, aggressive behavior, inappropriate cell phone usage. I kind of track what is, because I represent a lot of kids in disciplinary situations and also kids that get arrested. I kind of track what are the issues. For a long while, it was cyberbullying, which kind of morphed into inappropriate sexual content or sexting. Vaping has, when school is in-person learning, has eclipsed everything right now. Possession of the paraphernalia alone is an offense. And other obvious ones, alcohol, tobacco, drug use, fighting, etc. But these are common, issues that pop up. All right. I want to talk about use of school policing and the police resource centers. And Really, I call it the perfect storm. It's horrifying when you get a call from the principal or the superintendent that your child's being suspended. If you got a call from the police that your child was being arrested, you would be even more horrified. But if both of those things were happening at the same time in a school district where parents talk and you've got public outcry, maybe even press coverage, okay, that is a perfect storm of things that are happening. And you need to navigate that perfect storm while protecting your child, okay? And why does this happen? Kids with ADHD, we've already discussed, are at higher risk. Increased police presence at schools. And I'm going to talk a little bit about school resource officers. Community pressure, frightening headlines, police involvement. Schools, whether or not there are a school resource officer, schools are referring cases that they would normally treat in-house to the police on a more frequent basis. And as a result, because they now consider it a police matter, a girl texts her boyfriend an inappropriate sexual picture of herself, okay? Because that is technically a crime, she is in possession of child pornography and has disseminated child pornography, even though she's the child herself. Schools are referring those cases out to the police, and now they consider it a police matter, so the suspension is much higher because it's considered a police matter, even if the police don't prosecute. Parents have to defend a suspension and a criminal prosecution. I do both, but there are maybe 10 of us that focus on this in the country. I regularly teach other lawyers continuing legal education and do seminars for judges on these issues. And as more kids are getting arrested for conduct at school and suspended at the same time, there's a much bigger need for it. I get retained not only by parents, but by other attorneys because they don't handle the criminal part of the case or the school part of the case. So you need to know that. There are different consequences in court versus school consequences. And another thing that's very important, if your child did something hideous, something extremely violent or sexual, and is incarcerated, and it's appropriate for them to be incarcerated, the school still has an obligation to provide their IEP services. Are they getting them? How are they getting them? That's very important that you request a meeting to determine how are they getting those services in the facility. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about school policing, SROs, school resource officers, or another common hybrid is an off-duty security guard, an off-duty police officer that's a security guard at the school. At least 52% of schools, when I started doing these presentations, it was about 30-something%. Now it's 52% of schools throughout the country have some type of in-house policing, okay? The intent is to make students safer, but that's not the case. That's not what's happening statistically. We as a society feel that with all of these school shootings, having a police officer on site is going to protect our children. Statistically, that doesn't happen, but nobody's going to change their mind about this. So we have to navigate this minefield, okay? It raises constitutional issues. I call the blurred blue line. Typically, for instance, a principal will have a student who did something wrong, strike another student or a teacher, come to their office and write an apology letter. Sometimes they call it a responsibility letter, accepting responsibility for what they did and apologizing for it, which I understand. But if they're brought to the principal's office by a school resource officer or a off-duty police officer who's a security guard, they are now being forced to write a written confession to potentially criminal behavior in front of someone who has the authority to arrest them, okay? That is a constitutional issue. So it's kind of, I call it the blurred blue line. There are other issues that pop up in terms of searches at school. You need to know as a parent, and your children need to know, that their lockers are not their personal property. The school will tell you that the school has a key to those lockers, they're the property of the school. So under the law, your child does not have a reasonable expectation of privacy there. So the school can search them, okay? There is, unfortunately, no requirement that school resource officers, all of the ones I know and work with, do have some training, but there's no requirement to be a school resource officer that you have crisis intervention training to de-escalate these situations instead of arresting kids or restraining children with disabilities. The other issue that comes up with SROs quite frequently is that they are there for safety in the event of a school shooting, okay, or some type of external danger. They should not be enforcing the code of conduct. And in fact, what happens on a practical basis, if a student in the classroom gets out of hand or a teacher gets angry enough, they feel like the school resource officer is the enforcer and they call for the school resource officer. If the kid's in the red zone, there's a case here that I wanted to address here. There was a student in Virginia, 11 years old, that kicked the trash can over. The SRO charged the student with disorderly conduct and arrested an 11-year-old. A couple of weeks later, that same student left the classroom without permission. The SRO grabbed the student pushed back. They were slammed to the ground. This is an 11-year-old, and handcuffed and arrested for a felony assault on a police officer, okay? This is the type of thing that happens without parameters. So what I would suggest to you, school resource officers also contribute to the school to prison pipeline. Schools with SROs have 4 times more arrests than schools without, and students at those schools are 5 times more likely to be arrested, disabled students, excuse me. This disproportionately impacts African-American students and also disabled students. So just be aware of that. Because whether or not they're effective at making our students safer, as a society, this is not going to go away anytime soon. So what you need to do as a parent, as a concerned parent of a student with a behavioral potential, is to get active in your school board, your SEPTA, your special ed PTA, your PTA, and really try to set parameters that perhaps require some crisis intervention training to prevent these issues from escalating, and teach them some de-escalation techniques, to set parameters on their ability to enforce the code of conduct or not. Those are issues that you can have a say on, okay? So just be aware of them. Let's see. Okay, just to kind of finish up here, and I know I'm going a little over. Students with ADHD and co-occurring conditions are at a much higher risk for school discipline. It's important for parents to understand how this process works and how their child's behavior impacts their disability and makes them at higher risk, and also how this is magnified because of the situation we're in with COVID and coming out of it. The importance of a diagnosis and documentation and creating a record and a paper trail. Parents need to understand the law and the administrative process in terms of school discipline so they can navigate it appropriately. Extreme circumstances can also lead to police intervention and prosecution, and you have to be ready to navigate that perfect storm. Like, these are some strategies that I went over. Understand your child's disability and how it impacts behavior. That's important so that you can address these things proactively, or at least start building a record to help protect them if something terrible happens. Read and understand and question the code of conduct at school. Have them evaluated as early as possible, and involve their clinician in these issues to make recommendations for behavioral interventions if it's necessary. Seek an IEP or a 504 plan to protect them. Seek a functional behavioral assessment or a behavioral intervention plan. Requesting a transition planning post-COVID if you think it's necessary. If you think your child was always difficult to get out of bed, for instance, and they were used to going from their bedroom to the living room for remote instruction, and you don't see how you're going to get them out the door in the morning once in-person learning starts again, alert the school to that in advance before you rack up a bunch of late attendance notices, and potentially the school contacting the authorities that you're enabling something. So, really think ahead of time to kind of plot a course here. Talk to your child about their triggers and try to develop ways around them to redirect them before they go into that meltdown or red zone. And again, with respect to school policing, question the parameters of your child's school resource officers, in terms of training for students with disabilities, and also what their role is with respect to the code of conduct. That is my presentation. And I apologize for going a little over, but if anyone has questions, please feel free to jump in here.
So we have a couple questions in the Q&A, a little bit different ones. Is there a statute of limitations in Connecticut for filing a lawsuit against the district for abuse of a child's rights?
Abuse of?
The child's rights?
Well, if it's an educational issue, under federal law, you can go back 2 years to question services, placement, any of that stuff. If you believe your child's civil rights have been violated, there are, I would speak to a Connecticut attorney. I'm not admitted in Connecticut, I apologize. But I would definitely speak to someone in Connecticut. And federally, you also may have a claim. And also you may want to contact the American Civil Liberties Union or a national organization that represents people whose civil rights have been violated.
Here's another one. As far as executive functioning skills, can it be trained to improve these skills? And if so, I'm assuming it's Wilton Public Schools offer help to a student in need, like a class in executive functioning or something, or outside of school? So how would she find someone to help train kind of psychologist, therapist for especially executive functioning?
Okay. There are a number of, they used to call themselves ADHD coaches. Now they call themselves executive functioning coaches, because the executive functioning aspect of ADHD are really what they work on. They are typically private. I don't know of any schools in the Northeast that do this. I actually used to be the executive director of a national nonprofit that provides, we have a network of coaching throughout the country for students with ADHD and executive functioning impairment for high school and college students. And that organization actually started pilot programming in the Pacific Northwest in Seattle, where we were based. It's called the EDGE Foundation, and actually brings coaches into schools to work with students with executive functioning impairment. Because a lot of, I would say, you have to understand something. ADHD is not a barrier or an impairment of their intelligence, okay? It is a performance impairment, okay? And so every kid that I've represented are extremely bright kids, but they learn and they process information differently. And a lot of times parents will get tutors or ask for extra help at school. Now, when it comes to behaviors, behavioral interventions and those plans are things that can be done at school. But in terms of executive functioning, a coach who is specially trained to work with students and provide that, essentially it's an external form of structure, support, and accountability. And what I like about coaching also is that it's a talent-based model. They help your child understand that there are things that they are very, very good at. And there are also things that they have extreme impairments at. And the trick here is really to gravitate towards those strengths while you are kind of dancing around those weaknesses. And a coach does that in a non-judgmental way. And so I would encourage people to go to edgefoundation.org to learn more about coaching. There's an ADHD coaches organization that I think it's addcoaches.org. There's a place that is in New York and Connecticut called New Frontiers in Learning that has on-site coaches that work with students, but I'm unaware of any schools that specifically do it. And if the Wilton Public Schools are interested in developing some type of coaching program, I would be very happy to volunteer and, try to help them, introduce them to some experts to do that.
I know the Wilton, the high school do run executive functioning class,
Okay.
but I don't know particularly if this child is in Middlebrook or where. I only heard at the high school. They might started it in the middle school. I don't know. So here's another question. What diagnosis can schools in New York make following a neuropsych evaluation? Can they diagnose dyslexia, ODD, ADHD? What can a parent do if no diagnosis is made, even though testing was done and the child seems to have issues, especially with dyslexia and ADHD? My experience with that test was done, but no diagnosis was made.
Okay. Well, first of all, it depends on the type of person that you go to. You will need some type of diagnosis to be classified. For a 504 plan, and again, the difference really is, I'm oversimplifying this because there is some crossover, but a 504 plan really is geared more towards accommodations versus an IEP is more towards services, okay? If your child needs a specific type of learning remediation, like for instance, they're dyslexic and they need some type of a reading program, what I would recommend is the person who did the testing, it depends on who it is. If it is someone who the school is using to test for a reading disability, it's unlikely that you would get a diagnosis. If you brought your child privately to someone, you will likely get a diagnosis. But because there is no formal diagnosis, does not necessarily preclude you from getting accommodations under 504. And if you think about the neuropsych, in my opinion, there are parents who are afraid to get their kids evaluated because they're afraid of labeling. But the diagnosis is less important to me as an advocate and attorney because the testing itself and the scoring and the results of those tests really serve as a blueprint to what services and support your child needs based upon whatever's going on. And so all of those subtests are crucial in terms of their working memory, in terms of their coding and decoding, their speech, their fine motor skills, whatever you can really focus on the type of services that you would do. Also, schools really aren't supposed to diagnose anything. That should be done by a clinician, and the school's position is that they should be providing support based upon the child's needs if they have a classifiable disability, or if it's not classifiable, if they have needs that are well documented. That's really essentially what it is. The standard is under 504, if your child's disability, whatever it is, substantially impairs a major life activity, which is what learning is for a child. So.
Would you have, you indicated parent needs to start early to address child behavior concerns with school. What should we do when they're in daycares? Well,
as early as daycare, if you believe that your child behaviorally, you have to think about something. As these kids get older, as I said before about oppositional defiant disorder, if it's not treated, it can morph into something more serious. As they get older and they start getting bigger, and their manifestations of their disability become louder or more significant, the stakes get higher. So if a 4-year-old is more aggressive than the other 4-year-olds or 3-year-olds in daycare, that's only going to get worse. Okay. So if you believe that there are behavioral issues with that child, tantrum behaviors, antisocial behaviors, physical behaviors, oppositional behaviors, as early as you notice them and believe, you have to think ahead. What's that child going to be like in middle school or high school if I do nothing? If you think about it now, and just as an aside to all of this, I was a former prosecutor and was a criminal defense attorney for many years. When I was diagnosed with ADHD around 2000, I was representing a lot of adolescents. And based upon my understanding and research about ADHD from my own disability, I started to notice different patterns in my clients, their antisocial behavior. And it wasn't always ADHD. Sometimes it was bipolarity. Sometimes it was other antisocial disabilities like autism spectrum disorders. But the reason as an attorney who represented a lot of adolescents with that were getting arrested, it occurred to me that when you're a defense attorney, you get the call too late. Johnny brought a gun to school. Johnny injured somebody in the cafeteria. Johnny brought drugs to school. If I was helping his parents get a behavioral intervention plan to appropriately address his behavioral symptoms when he was maybe in 3rd or 4th grade, maybe I wouldn't be getting as many of those calls when they're in high school. And that is the way I morphed my practice into a disability and education practice. And you really have to think about that as a parent of a child with a disability, is that if I say nothing now, you can't put your head in the sand and hope that they don't get into trouble. You really need to kind of set that stage and that paper trail to protect them for the future.
Okay, so we have
Want to take one more, maybe?
one more question, 2 more questions. I have one. They're coming in a little bit everywhere. So let me just 1 second. So with regard to school avoidance, a student that has an IEP, can a school district threaten to call DCF if the parents do not allow psychologists into the home to assess what are the patient's and students' rights?
Okay. Well, first of all, there are a couple of things you need to know on a practical scale. First of all, in addition to conduct that can get your child suspended, if it is deemed a school avoidance issue and you are considered by the school an enabling parent, the school, in order to protect itself, will essentially notify ECS, whatever the acronym is now. It changes every couple of years. That you are, at risk for enabling your child not to attend school, and under mandatory school age of 16 or before their 17th birthday, you can get into legal trouble yourself as a parent. So, and I've worked on a lot of these cases. A couple of things you need to know in terms of your rights when you get that knock on the door. Okay. First of all, now that you've seen this presentation, if your child has difficulty getting out the door in the morning, you should be aware of it, and you should take some steps to address it by creating a paper trail with the school, writing letters to the school. I'm having difficulty. I'm not able to get him up in the morning because of his disability. What support can you offer me? I'm requesting help. Behavioral supports. If your child is seeing a therapist, getting that therapist involved so that when you do get that call, that knock on the door from that agency, you have a doctor that you can call right away to tell them this is a manifestation of this child's disability. The parents are working with me to try to, alleviate it, and working with the school to kind of soften those issues. They will typically want to speak to the child. The defendant or accused in those cases is really the parent. And what happens is, if you assert that you won't let your child speak with them unless you're present, they will often say, then we're going to take that as you're not cooperating with the investigation. And that will kind of be looked at negatively towards you. So what I often, if you're worried about what your child may say out of impulse, or that they may just say something inappropriate, then what I recommend in some of these cases is have their therapist or say to the people that their therapist really needs to be present. They have, high anxiety levels, or, this is going to kind of freak them out a little bit. And they're working with a therapist who wants to be present. And as parents, we will step out. So that someone will be with them during that process, and that you are being deemed to be cooperative. Now, they will tell you a lot of times that if this is a household where they don't need to be concerned, that, this isn't a big deal, you've been cooperative with us, this is going to blow over. They typically have 60 days to complete their investigation. The person who's assigned to the case has to write it up and go over it. They almost always take that 60 days, really for just to kind of cover themselves and keep it open as long as they can if, God forbid, something happens while this is going on. But, knowing as a parent that this could happen if your child is missing school, is chronically late to school, you can take measures ahead of time to show people that you are aggressively trying to address it, can soften that blow, or maybe prevent the school from actually making that call to report you.
So Robert, we have two more questions. I don't know how much time you have.
Let's see, where are we? Let's try these last two questions before we go.
Okay, so if a child on the spectrum have moved to a new district, that after 3 days in the new school district, so they cannot educate him, they do not have services to provide him with an appropriate education, they requested outplacement, and while they wait to find an outplacement, he has had restraint, seclusion, and suspension. School has a BCBA working with him, yet they are saying they don't need to do an FBA or a BIP, being he'll be going to a different placement. Are they responsible to perform these evals while waiting for the placement?
They are not responsible in all cases. If the child is disciplined because of that, and it is part of what's going on, if they're on the spectrum, for instance, and that's part of their disability, then that is where the legal requirement to do an FBA or BIP kicks in. I mean, I would imagine the school would make an argument that if there is a BCBA, which is a board certified behavioral analyst working with the child at the school, that in and of itself is a behavioral intervention. Even now, the law requires that certain things be in a functional behavioral assessment, and that a behavioral intervention plan address what comes out of the behavioral assessment. So it can't just be, we're going to do more. It has to actually address what they've learned from the behavioral assessment, and go through them line by line, and address those and tell how they're going to address them. But the requirement to do it is only after the suspension issue.
Okay, so here's a last question. Or what about a second grader that have been placed in a room by themselves with the one-on-one student not getting instruction from the teacher? They have done one FBA from pre-K and are only updating the new behavior plan by calling 911 or 211. The student needs to have 3 consecutive days in order to do an activity with his peers. Also, the parent has asked for testing for autism. The school said they can't because the testing was not designed to be completed with masks on. Thought on this?
I don't know what that means.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the question is.
And I will tell you, my opinion is calling 911 is not a behavioral intervention to address a child's disability. That is the school wanting to do something, okay? That has nothing to do with addressing the child's needs, okay? And there are restrictions on a school's ability to restrain or seclude your student. And there's a couple of things that are going on here. Unless there's an imminent risk to other students, they should not be doing that. It's illegal. And the other part of it is, if they are putting your child for your child's own safety or other people's safety in a secluded room, are they getting instruction? And if they're not getting instruction, that is an issue that you need to address. And I would certainly request an IEP meeting right away to address those concerns, and a behavioral plan that includes calling the police. And if you disagree with them and the school will not change them, you should speak to an attorney about filing for an impartial hearing and to get a realistic FBA and behavioral intervention plan ordered, and to set parameters on that school, or to seek a placement at a private school or a state-approved non-public school that can meet your child's needs, because it doesn't sound like they're being met where you are. So, but this involves taking the school to task, and it's something that you need to do. And just as a quick aside, I've been through high school, college, law school, and I've got a lot of years experience. My belief truly is that the most powerful force in the universe is a mom on a mission trying to protect their child. So that is, organizations like SpedNet, like Smart Kids with LD, those types of organizations are typically founded by moms who want to do something to get more services, more support, more help. So don't underestimate your ability to effectuate change.
So,
I would just
I hope
wanted
that was
to,
helpful.
yeah, I think there's, it was just a statement. But I think if you have any other specific questions in regards of diagnosis and stuff, you can send them to us and we can try to help you out on the road.
also,
And
if it
you can also
seems
email
that,
me.
Huh?
okay. Everyone, so we have your email address and
Yeah.
phone
Should
number
be on
on
the
the
screen.
slide that's up.
Yeah, and also for the executive functioning coach, we did have a very good webinar, which is on our website and YouTube, of Kelly Schwenkmeyer. And that was also very helpful if you guys want to go watch that in terms of executive functioning. So with that, I think we need to call it a day. Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Robert. It was
Thank you so much,
great.
Robert.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
for having me.